The glow of the 6 a.m. sky illuminated the pure white mansion in a soft blue. The estate appeared to be quiet and peaceful in this lighting, but that wasn't the case at all. More vehicles entered the estate than ever before this morning, and to Wren it merely seemed like an SUV showing. He was still in a state of paranoia after last week's events. The gardener slowly pruned flowers while keeping a watchful eye on the incoming vehicles. He squinted past the rising beams of the morning sun and counted the rifled men guarding the estate gates.
Wren, darling, don't be so tense.
Startled out of his state of concentration, the gardener quickly turned around to see a beaming Mrs. Marbles. "Oh, I'm just keeping my eyes peeled for any suspicious ones," the gardener said, while quickly looking back at the approaching vehicles outside the gates. Mrs. Marbles followed Wren's now concentrated gaze and smacked her lips.
Oh, Wren, you were just as paranoid when the construction workers were over last week fixing the kitchen.
"Well, you never know. It just seems like a bit much," replied Wren, who went back to focusing on his flower pruning. The maid now had her hands on her hips and looked around at all the SUVs in the driveway.
Well, Wren, I'll tell you what. There's going to be much more where the lot of them came from. The recruitment was done elsewhere, so all this you see going on is all for a meeting. Plus, they're all going to be stationed in different areas throughout the city, Gotham, and even Arkham.
The maid slowly knelt down next to the gardener and placed her delicate hand on his shoulder.
And frankly, my friend, after all my years of being in this business, I've learned that having power in this world is nothing but a grand scheme of survival of the fittest. You've got nothing to worry about. Mr. White knows exactly what he's doing, and that says a lot coming from me.
Before Wren could reply, a loud cackle echoed through the estate. Mrs. Marbles smiled and raised her brows at the gardener, who shook his head, returning the smile. All right, get out of here. You're interrupting my pruning," Wren joked. Mrs. Marbles nudged the gardener playfully, where she then walked back towards the rear of the mansion. The handheld radio that she kept clipped to her apron crackled, and an elated voice muffled in,
"Close it up. All my toads have arrived for the tea party. You all have 2 minutes and 32 seconds. 31, 30.
The radio crackled once again until it became silent. Mrs. Marbles unclipped the radio from her apron, held down the side button and brought it up to her face.
I'm entering the garages now.
The radio crackled again, and a few more voices also tuned in. "On it, boss." "Got it, sir." "Yes, sir." Mrs. Marbles pressed the button that closed the doors behind her. Upon entering the dining room, which was now emptied as the mansion had a few renovations within the week, she paused in her tracks to listen to what was going on in the next room. What would have been the entertainment room was now a room for meetings. All that could be heard were the sounds of men conversing amongst themselves behind the oak French doors. Mrs. Marbles knew that the meeting hadn't started yet due to all the chatter, so she decided to head towards the stairs. Before she could reach for the door handle, the cackle from earlier returned, and it too echoed behind the doors to the staircase. The cackle seemed to reverberate off the walls, and the loud chatter in the next room even slowed to a dull roar. Then, the doors to the staircase opened slowly to reveal the tall man with the green hair. He was dressed in an all-black fitted suit, but with a dark purple dress shirt. Despite the red paint on his lips, his cheekbones were raised high to form a very wide smile. Mrs. Marbles smiled back at him and slightly bowed her head. The man let go of the door handles and the door closed slowly behind him. He reached into his right trouser pocket and took out 2 shiny golden cufflinks that appeared to be spades. He looked down at his dress shirt cuffs and then flashed his eyes toward the doors that led to the meeting room. With eyes still fixed on the doors, he adjusted his wrist cuffs to attach the cufflinks and said, "Marbles, you've been loyal for so long. If you wish to join the meeting, you may." He finally looked down at his fixed cufflinks and then looked at Mrs. Marble, who was staring intently at him. She took a big gulp and knew that what he had told her was a big deal, even if it didn't appear that way to anyone else. She nodded her head and her smile returned. "Should you join us, you understand that there is no room for careless errors, nor are there to be little conversations about any of the information with your little gardening friend or anyone else. Yes?" the man inquired, with a hint of amusement in his voice. Mrs. Marbles realised that he had heard everything she had told Wren earlier. No part about it was bad, but she felt foolish all the same. The man looked pleased at her slightly bemused expression and added, "And should you disobey these rules, you understand that there will be consequences, yes?" Mrs. Marbles nodded her head in agreement and quickly replied,
Forgive me, sir. I was just trying.
"Ah, he will learn," the man interrupted. "But you agreed, so there's nothing more to fuss about." The maid smiled and nodded in agreement once again. She was just pleased to know that he wasn't horribly angry with her. "Grand," replied the man. He strolled over to the meeting room doors and swiftly flung them open. Men of all different heights filled the room, and they all fell silent upon the tall man's entrance. Behind this man was a maid who smiled politely at all the men and took a seat near the back. The men were all dressed in black outerwear and looked well built. They made way for the tall man, who walked towards them all and formed a circle around him when he reached the centre. "Lady," the tall man began, while glancing at the maid, "and boys." The tall man grinned widely and walked slowly in a circle while his audience watched. "Wait, this is who we're gonna work for?" whispered one of the men in the crowd to the other guy next to him. I guess," the other person replied. "Look at him. This guy's a fucking joke," the first man added. "Did somebody say joke?" asked the tall man loudly. He spun around on his heel and faced the two men whispering in the middle of the crowd. They looked at him, and the first man to speak replied, "Yeah, so what?" The tall man interlocked his gloved fingers behind his back, looked up at the vaulted ceiling above, and said, "Introduce yourself." "Okay, they call me Brock." The tall man looked back at Brock, his piercing hazel eyes searing through Brock's dark brown ones. "And your friend?" asked the tall man without looking away. Brock shifted uncomfortably as the tall man continued to make eye contact with him. He felt an odd presence about this man, who had a painted-on smile across his lips, but looked at him with eyes that represented something else entirely. Brock broke eye contact and looked at the guy next to him, who he nudged with his elbow. Oh, I'm Jace," the other guy said confidently. "Well, Brock and Jace, what's the joke you both speak of?" inquired the tall man. He grinned widely as he waited for the answer. Jace itched his nose and looked at Brock, who decided not to speak up. The tall man tilted his head and frowned at them. "Oh no, Brock! One of the most important rules of comedy. Don't leave your audience hanging. I think I'm starting to hear the crickets." The tall man smiled again and went on. "Brock, I'll tell you what. How about you tell me a joke, and if you make me laugh, your friend lives." The tall man turned his back to the men and let out a low chuckle. Suddenly, he reached his hand into his jacket and drew out a long-barreled .22 revolver. It was now pointing at Jace's face, and everyone in the room, besides the maid and Jace, ducked their heads. Jace's face went pale, and Brock rose his head back up slowly when he noticed that the tall man with the revolver was staring at him with a huge toothy grin. Jace's face went pale, and Brock rose his head back up slowly when he noticed that the tall man with the revolver was staring at him with a huge toothy grin. Wait, do I really need to tell you a joke?" he asked as he looked back at a terrified Jace who had his hands raised. The tall man kept his eyes on Brock and cocked the revolver. Okay. Brock was interrupted by a shout of shrill laughter. The tall man was laughing so hard that he held his stomach with both arms, with the gun still in his hand. The audience of men surrounding the laughing man looked around at each other. As the man was laughing, a deck of cards fell out of his jacket pocket. Jace remained idle with his hands raised, and Brock furrowed his brow as he looked down at all the different joker cards that were now scattered on the floor. The laughing man slowed to a chuckle and looked back at Brock. "Oh, Brocky! Now that was funny." "Wait a second," said Brock, whose eyes were now darting from card to card. "You're the guy who... Mr. Mostrino? Last month." The tall man chuckled and said, "Oh, you mean Frankie? Why, yes, he was quite the squirmer. How could I forget?" The men in the room looked around at each other once again, but remained quiet. When Jay saw that the man seemed no longer interested in shooting him, he lowered his hand slowly, still keeping his eyes on the revolver. Brock looked back up at the tall man, timidly this time. The man smiled and started to walk slowly around the circle.
Now, before I was rudely interrupted, allow me to introduce myself, he said.